Assalamu alaikum and hello to our listening audience. My name is Aminah Al-Deen. Uh, and tonight on Critical Talk, which is a production of Sound Vision and on various uh, platforms, as you can see below, we're going to talk about freedom of speech, freedom of expression. And before we do all of that, and especially in this hot climate today, we're going to have a little introduction to constitutional law class. For definitions, many among us don't know the definitions we need to know. So, with us tonight, I have Attorney Edward Mitchell, who is a civil rights attorney, a former journalist, who serves as the National Deputy Executive Director. That's a lot of title, dude. Of the Council on American Islamic Relations. We also have attorney Anthony Simpkins, who is the President and Chief Operating Officer of Neighborhood Housing Services of Chicago. We also have Saad Gul, who is a practicing Washington attorney specializing in appellate, regulatory, and privacy issues. None of us know what that means, but we will find out. And last but certainly not least, to take us into the issues of today, we have Sydney Thornton, who is a junior political science major at Howard University. Welcome, all of you. Salaam alaikum. And hello to those of you who may or may not be Muslim or not owning up to it.
Walaikum assalam.
I would like to start our conversation in definitions. As all of the attorneys know, the Constitution, amongst many other things, talks about rights, privileges, and immunities. The issue is, what is that? What is the because we use the terms just interchangeably. So you can all take one at a time. You can jump in, add, correct. I'm not even going to tell you what I think because, as Attorney Simpkins knows, I didn't finish law school.
Probably best for your health, doctor.
Huh?
Probably best for your health.
Oh, let me tell you, my hat goes up, hat scarf goes off to everybody who finished it. Okay, so what's a right?
I don't know if anybody else wants to start, but when the founding fathers set up this system of government, it's governed by a constitution, and that constitution sets out certain rights that citizens of the country have, and through various Supreme Court rulings and all kinds of other stuff, they've sort of detailed exactly what those rights are. And they're all the way from the right to interstate travel, the right to sort of physical bodily integrity. A number of those rights were actually specifically set out in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights.
Don't add stuff we haven't gotten to yet. Now, I know, and I learned this, and I stopped a whole class over this. I didn't know that before commerce law, that you could not travel from state to state, and it had something to do with slavery. Freaked me out. You know what I'm saying? Whoa, wait a minute, stop.
Yes, well, the Constitution itself talks about the fact that the federal government has authority over interstate commerce. And so a lot of the rights that we take for granted now are based upon interpretations that certain things fit into this category of interstate commerce. The 14th
Okay, but
Amendment.
I'm just saying, I want you to stick and define rights, because according to me, I got all the rights in the world. What is a right?
Well, perhaps our civil rights scholars can elaborate on that.
I'm afraid to jump into the water now, but Anthony. So I'll briefly try, inshallah. So first, I think we have to back up a bit because you didn't ask what is a right under American law. You just said what's a right in general, right? So for me, a right is your guaranteed ability to do something, right? So as human beings, we have what some would say are human rights to do certain things, no matter what country we're in. As people created by God, we have certain basic rights that God has given us that we have to fulfill and can fulfill no matter where we are. And as Americans, yes, we are guaranteed certain abilities to do things in this country by the Constitution.
Everybody?
Everyone.
Migrants?
Including people who aren't American citizens, by the way. The nice thing about the Constitution is that many of its guarantees, including the right to free speech and other things, apply to people who even are not American citizens, up to a point. Now, so what I'll say briefly, and then I'm going to be quiet before I get in trouble, is that you said
Too late.
Rights, privileges, immunities. So again, your rights often refer to your guaranteed ability, protected by the government, to speak, to go somewhere, to marry, other such things that we all take for granted and do during our lives here in the United States. Your privileges, that usually is referring to not necessarily things that individuals do, but usually things that states can do without interference from the federal government. And same thing with immunities, that goes beyond individuals and refers to government actors. So it gets a bit complex. I don't want us to go into law school here, but that's my brief answer to your very, very complex question.
And I'd like to add a couple of things, if I may.
Please.
Not to contradict the boss, but there's a couple of things. When we were talking before the show, often folks are not, into the nitty gritty of constitutional law, which is hardly surprising. But the Bill of Rights, which was referred to, is actually the first 10 amendments to the Constitution.
The Bill of Rights. Can you put that up on the screen? Because that's important. No. What's the Bill of Rights?
That would be the first 10 amendments. So the First Amendment really covers the freedom of speech, the freedom to petition the government, and so on. But there are two things that I wanted to point out. One is that for a long time, the Bill of Rights did not apply to the states. It was after the 14th Amendment, it was held that they were applicable to the states, and the extent to which they apply is still in the eyes of the beholder. The other thing that I'd point out is that one of the amendments specifically says that just because a right is not enumerated here doesn't mean that you don't have it under constitutional law, which goes back to Edward's point. Rights come from several places, but that's particularly interesting because the Constitution itself says because it's not in the text doesn't mean that you don't have it under the law. The problem is who gets to decide whether or not you have that right as let's use the term person, as a United States person, whether or not you're a citizen, long-term permanent, resident alien or something else. So those two issues, I think, have continued to haunt the law for at least post-Reconstruction.
Okay, so let me go back to Attorney Simpkins for a minute. You started us down this very dark hole. What is the Bill of Rights?
So as he said, the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So right after the Constitution was ratified, they realized there were some other protections, really, if you will. I mean, essentially what the Bill of Rights, the rights that are in the Bill of Rights are really cast as immunities, if you will. They are limited.
That means you can't do something to me. Like if I get a COVID shot,
exactly.
I might not get COVID.
Yes, they are primarily limits on the ability of the government to interfere with you doing what you want to do, right? So limits on interfering with your ability to say what you want, to your ability to worship as you like, your ability to go where you want to go, your ability to keep your personal papers and effects private, right? So most of the Bill of Rights is really about limits on the power of government over the individual. And then, as he said, the 14th Amendment basically says, if you're a citizen of any of the states, then all of these rights apply to you equally. So everybody's got the same set of rights. And then there are a number of rights that actually are applicable to just people. If you are a person in the United States, even if you're not a citizen, there are some rights that apply to you as well.
So, two things I'm hearing. Total confusion here. The Bill of Rights is the first. Don't be smiling at me, Edward. The Bill of Rights is.
No, I'm just having flashback to law school. You are traumatizing me after a very stressful week.
The Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments, right?
That's correct.
How many amendments are there?
Ooh, that's a good question.
27.
Ooh.
Yeah, something like 27.
27? Maybe. I hope so. Otherwise, I got to turn in my law license.
So that means that they kept messing up and they had to go back and add something.
I believe Sydney answered first, so kudos. You got us.
You are having too much fun. Go ahead.
Well, some were technical, like prohibition. And they said, well, maybe that wasn't such a good idea after all. And so there was a Second Amendment to repeal that. Others were much more substantive. For example, I believe it was the 19th that gave women the right to vote nationwide. They'd been able to vote in some territories before them.
Now, you also said something about the rights did not apply to all the states.
Initially, it was held that the rights and but some of the rights, frankly, all the rights in the Bill of Rights was supposed to reign in the federal government, but not the state governments. And so, if you wanted relief, you'd look for it in your state constitution. The idea was that had changed with the 13th and 14th Amendment and Reconstruction, but obviously we're still, arguing about it, a century and a half later, so that didn't solve it. But to give you,
it took them a century to figure out they messed up the first part.
Well, it took a civil war, I think, for them to figure out that.
It's about men at a table, Sydney. We'll straighten it out one day.
And then, and part of it is, of course, Reconstruction. It's very controversial, and
Well, one of the things we can't do in this sitting, but I want to go back to the right is. Nobody can interfere with me doing something. Is that what I'm being told, Edward? That's what a right is? Or
Again,
particular things?
you can define it different ways from my perspective. If you're asking about a right in general, not necessarily the American code, but just in general, it is your guaranteed ability to do something. That is a right in its most simplest form. In the American context, it is your ability, your guaranteed ability, protected by the government, to do certain things, whether that's speak, to protest, to vote, and other such things that the government guarantees you the ability to do that thing. Up to a point.
So when we move over to privileges, Simpkins, what are privileges?
Well, privileges then gets into the area of what it means to be a citizen, right? So the idea
Are the privileges only accorded citizens?
as I understand, again, I will defer to the other experts here. Rights assume that as human beings, we basically have sort of the inherent right to do certain things, and the Constitution is set up to say, of those things, the government has a limited amount of power to infringe upon your ability to do those freely, right? And it's set up to say, because we got to run this society, we got to run this government, everybody can't just do anything that they want, right?
Okay, but
that's up certainly privileges are things that you should be able to do because you are a citizen. There are things that the government yes.
So I'm the thing is giving me, I can do that thing, but a state can step in and restrict my right.
Well, as we said, with the passage of the 14th Amendment, all of those rights and privileges that you had vis-a-vis the federal government, 14th Amendment basically said you have them vis-a-vis the state governments too. And so that was the purpose of the 14th Amendment. So a privilege would be like, for instance, voting, right?
Voting is a privilege?
Yes, voting is not a natural right, but as a citizen of the United States, you now have to be accorded by the government the right to vote. And that's why it's considered a privilege as opposed to a right. Right is more sort of
inalienable
concept of natural rights, right? Privileges are something that your sort of covenant with the government that you're going to operate as a citizen allows you then to access this ability or resource.
Okay. So essentially, summarizing, amendments were needed for things that had been overlooked or left out of the Constitution as it was first written. It certainly didn't apply to all the people on the soil, as we well know, or the two genders. It applied to one gender, white landowning folk, right? I don't know if that was because they paid taxes or what that would give them the right.
Then they were the ones that made the rules.
There you go. They still are. Anyway, so then we have something called privileges, which are accorded to whom? Special groups. Who? Besides, we know one group is citizens. Now, privileges don't apply to migrants.
My understanding is it depends on the privilege in question. So, for example, the right to a public education does apply, and I've always seen privileges and immunities, at least in the case law, and my colleagues might have seen different cases, but the ones that I saw generally held that the privileges and immunities of a citizen of one state, for example, North Carolina, would also apply to the citizens of another one. So, if you crossed the border, went to South Carolina or Virginia, you'd still have the same privileges and immunities available to you, which was not always the case in American history.
Do you have something to add, Edward?
No, not on this. I defer.
Okay, so well, I'm not gonna let you off the hook. So when we go to CARE, which is the Muslims' foremost civil rights organization, it is really an organization that guards our privileges.
No, I think it's more than that. So, our focus is first and foremost on protecting the right of the American Muslim community to live, worship, work, and otherwise exist as Muslims in this country. Now, most of our focus is obviously on the civil rights of the American Muslim community, but also beyond that, we do protect the privileges of American Muslims and other rights and guarantees that may be violated by the government or individuals. So Saad is one of our new attorneys. He can speak a little more to the types of cases that we're dealing with, but we cover the gamut of things that would impact the ability of American Muslims to live, work, and worship and travel and otherwise exist in this country.
So if Naeem came to you with a potential case about some Muslims not being permitted to say buy or move into or even develop some housing in Chicago, that would be a civil rights breach?
So I guess I'll just get a lawyer answer. It depends. Why are they being denied the right to do this? Is it because of zoning rules? Is it because of a logistical problem? Is it because of actual legitimate issues that the city or the state has with their project? Or is it because they're Muslim? Is it because of the nature of their project? So it depends. But certainly if anyone is being denied the right to establish a house of worship or to build housing because of their race, ethnicity, or some other protected characteristic, that would be a violation of federal law, and obviously just wrong. But Saad, maybe we can share a little more detail on that point if you'd like.
Okay.
I think you hit the nail on the head with it depends. There could be a valid reason for denying folks, the ability to build there, but sometimes there's a pretext and it's very thin and you can see right through it, which is why we have discovery. But other than that, as Edward said, they have rights as citizens to, regardless of religion, ethnicity, race, to be able to build, on the same basis as any other folks in the country.
Okay. This is Professor Aminah Al-Deen with Critical Talk. I have a wonderful set of folk. Saad Gul, a Washington attorney. I have Edward Mitchell, civil rights attorney for CARE, and Anthony Simpkins, who's the president, chief operating officer of Neighborhood Housing Services of Chicago, and a practicing attorney, and me, who practices nothing anywhere. We'll be right back. And when we come back, I want Sydney, our student, but also a student who has taken on an activist role, to also, in addition to telling us about why she does what she does, what are her questions, and for the three of you to tell her how to best protect herself. We'll be right back. Good early evening. This is Professor Aminah Al-Deen with Critical Talk, having a lively discussion on rights, privileges, immunities, all to get to a real discussion on freedom of expression, freedom of speech, because things seem to be getting very, very cloudy. With me this evening, I have Attorney Anthony Simpkins, Attorney Edward Mitchell, Attorney Saad Gul, and a wonderful student, Sydney Thornton. So, Sydney, tell us about what you're doing at Howard. At the moment, we cannot hear Sydney.
Can you hear any of us?
Yep.
Okay.
You can hear us?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay.
Sydney, unmute yourself.
I think she's frozen, Doctor.
Oops. Okay. So let's open it up while we're waiting for her. And that is in the First Amendment. The First Amendment tells us what the government can't restrict. So why is the government running around restricting everything? And even trying to pass laws to restrict them. Not the establishment of a religion, although that might be next on the docket, but it's abridging the freedom of speech. I can talk about all three of your suits, but I can't talk about Gaza. Well, I can talk about Gaza if I talk about it in certain terms. I'm not a journalist, but I could be for a hot minute as long as I didn't write about that particular conflict in certain kinds of ways. I can write all day about what's going on in the Sudan or South Africa or West Africa. What is going on?
So, Doctor, I think what we've seen over the past few months has been an unprecedented campaign of censorship directed at Americans and others in this country who support Palestinian human rights. Students have been doxxed and harassed. Workers have been fired. Protesters have been attacked. And every day, Muslims and people who are visibly Palestinian have also experienced violence, including 3 young men who were shot in Burlington, Vermont, because they were wearing the Palestinian scarf. Now, it's important to note, though, that the First Amendment forbids the government from doing all of these things, restricting the rights, restricting freedom of religion, restricting free speech. It doesn't forbid a corporation necessarily from doing that, or a school, or another private actor. So we do have to distinguish between some of the censorship and harassment that is occurring as a result of private efforts to restrict speech, which is
so you mean like a university or Anthony's group. Yeah. It could be anything that's private. I mean, it could be private or public, but not state.
Right. Public entity, even public entities can, to some extent, for example, limit speech. We all know the classic example: you can't yell fire in a theater, right? But there's wide latitude for speech and religion, all sorts of things when it comes to what the government can't do. But private actors obviously have great leeway to restrict speech at a business, at a school, but it's not an unlimited right, especially if you are, for example, getting federal funding. There are all sorts of ways in which you may not be able to limit freedom of religion or freedom of speech or other such things in a private environment. But it's just important to note that a lot of the censorship we're seeing is not coming from the government, it's coming from private actors who do have the right to do that up to a point.
Well, so I see. Oh, there she is. Welcome back.
Sorry about that.
Okay, so tell us, Sydney, first how you got involved in this and what you're doing.
So I mainly got involved with this around October 17th, which is when I started our Howard University branch of Students for Justice in Palestine. The reason why I created it was because I was seeing a lack of response from organizations on Howard's campus. And I think that lack of response was due to fears of students getting doxxed, having previous retaliation from from the administration against protesters on campus. I think a lot of people were scared, and especially if you're under Howard's branch, and you're an official organization under Howard, you have to adhere to Howard's policies. So I think a lot of people were kind of hesitant. But for me, to wait till October 17th was far too long. So, yeah.
Well, wait a minute, because we didn't talk about codes of conduct.
Mm-hmm.
So, Howard, what is Howard's code of conduct?
So basically, Howard has their own rules around what you can and can't do for protesting. One of our last protests that we had was in front of the administration building, and they were trying to present it in an email that they sent to all the students and faculty members. They were trying to present it as if we were, they said menacing, and that as if we were a threat, when we were at most like 50 college students, just basically being like, we see what you're doing, we see that you are still silent, and basically making accusations. But the thing about that is those certain accusations are able to have us have consequences, such as getting kicked out of school, such as losing our scholarships. And unfortunately, even in cases like 2 years ago when there was protests against housing, and there was a lot of freshmen especially protesting on campus, which was Howard's longest protest in history. A lot of people lost their scholarships. A lot of people got kicked out. And a lot of stuff was kept under wraps because a lot of people had to sign NDAs. So we're trying to navigate these specific rules of what we can and can't do. But at the same time, Howard, they're okay with basically viewing things as they want to view it.
So, and you're looking at 3 attorneys who are going to at least make an offer to bring you on as an intern in the very near future. I'm always shopping. Anyway, no, because both of these organizations need young, bright minds. And young, bright minds who want to know and who are willing to take steps. And God only knows what the consequences for them are. Here we are. Let me see. Who is that? Do you know who that is?
The one speaking?
The person speaking on camera.
I believe, I might not be correct, but I believe she's a member of Students for Socialism in the DMV. And right there, that's Delaney. She's also a member of Students for Socialism. She's been very, very active and a big part of our success. And right there, that's Ahmed. He is one of our Palestinian students, a part of the graduate school. And his story alone, I mean, it's not just his story, it's his life, what he has to go through, what he's forced to being put through with lack of support from Howard. It's really sad. And even
wait a minute, what do you mean by lack? Howard University has a history of supporting all kinds of radicalism.
Yeah. So Howard as an institution, yeah, it has a history and a lot of it goes through the chapel. But unfortunately, there's still limitations to what they can do in terms of supporting us, in terms of outwardly supporting us.
Mm.
And because of those limitations, it kind of restricts just how loud we can be sometimes and what we want to say.
So in both, in all of the lawyers thinking, so one of the issues also with freedom of speech is a conflation of terms. If you're for Palestine, then you're either communist or socialist. I don't know if the students know the difference, but you're either one or the other, both of which are bad for American democracy. So therefore, you know what I'm saying? You're inching yourself to a margin that you probably don't know exists. But in terms of speech, what questions do you have of these learned men?
I guess I would have, to what extent can Howard restrict the speech that we say?
Well, Howard's a private university, correct?
Yes.
So they can be fairly stringent in, what they permit and what they don't. The First Amendment, as Edward noted, doesn't apply to private actors. Now,
That's everybody.
that's true to some extent. In practice, academia has been relatively tolerant on most issues. If you look at your handbook, some states will treat that as a contract, quote unquote, between the student and the institution. Not all of them will. So if you have that, then that gives you some sort of bright line rules. But even there, it's not always clear. So, for example, what constitutes harassment, of either a professor or, a fellow student? There's always room for discretion in there, and like beauty, sometimes harassment is in the eyes of the beholder.
Come on, you two. Wake up,
So-
get in here, help the young lady out.
So what I would add, Sydney, is that even though it is a private institution and therefore has great leeway, it is still bound to uphold the rules that it has established. So its employees and staff, they have a school handbook that applies not only to you but also to them, and there are certain guarantees that are given to you when you come on campus. And so as long as you as a student are operating within those guidelines and not violating those rules, which at most universities do protect a considerable amount of free speech, then you should be free to do that. Now, school can always change the rules and all that, but just practically speaking, if you are staying within the confines of those school established rules, then you should be fine. The problem, of course, is when rules are debatable, right? What is, for example, hate speech? What is not hate speech, right? Is saying free Palestine an act of hate? All of us would argue, of course not, obviously not. But what happens if your school suddenly decides, well, it is an act of hate? What do you do about that? And so obviously that's when you pick up a phone and call a lawyer and see what the situation is. We can't give you legal advice, of course. It depends, as always, but certainly what we say to any students who are experiencing what they believe to be unfair or unjust or even potentially illegal restrictions on their ability to speak, to worship, to protest, to certainly contact a civil rights organization so we can assess the situation and give you our honest opinion about whether or not there is something we can do to help you. Inshallah.
I think he makes a good point, is that there are resources out there to support the students in what they do. And one of the first things to look at is, as he said, that every school has a policy on these kinds of things. And they do have an obligation actually to apply those policies fairly. So they can't apply the policy one way to one ethnic or racial or political sort of view or set of students and apply it differently to another. So they do have an obligation to apply the rules equally.
But we're looking at a situation where um, different Congresses, I mean, I guess some of them are state, I'm not sure, are proposing bills to limit speech that can be considered anti Semitic. But anti Semitism is conflated with Zionism and is what side of the bed did you get up on today? And who are you upset with almost? Because people no longer can figure out what is what. At the same time, many in this country have railed against the Chinese. Who is that one of the groups that should have gotten a privilege of special protection? Is it any group that another group rails against? Who gets the special protection? Is it students? Because she won't know all the consequences of her activism today until tomorrow, right? She won't know if her scholarships for next year are good, if she's still going to get them. She doesn't know if she's applying to graduate and law school. If they're going to say, oh, no, you were one of those who founded whatever, Palestinian young folks on campus. So the consequences of her activism, speak to me.
So, Doctor, go ahead, Sydney. Go ahead, please.
I just wanted to add that that's a very real consequence that I think a lot of people are thinking of. And even things like canarymission.com, where they're actively, consistently doxing students left and right, where it's also things used by employers to background check. And people are afraid because we are already in a unsure economic market. And so if me as a political science student, who I'm not going to be making too much money off the bat, am going out and basically risking my already low barrier or bar that I'm going to be going towards, it's a big risk for some people. But for me personally, I don't like to see that as a risk, because I just don't like to put human rights below myself. But in regards to a lot of people, it's definitely scary. And I know a lot of the Muslim students on campus, especially Muslim students who might have their status in America a little hazy, it's even more of a fear, because on top of their future, they don't know if it'll get them in trouble in regards to them being here, especially with doxing being really rampant. And on top of that, the international students already don't have a lot of support. On top of that, they got their scholarships taken away recently by Howard. So there's already seen.
Are you serious?
Yeah, it's only merit-based scholarships for them now, and no longer need-based, which they can't even apply to FAFSA already. So it's a lot. It's a lot. And I'm trying to learn as much from as many communities as possible, because I come from a Christian African-American culture. So it's really been empowering to learn from the experiences of my fellow Black students that come from like Muslim families or Jewish families, who even those communities of like the different aspects of the diaspora, they've been left out of the conversation because it's just been a focus of the Christian African-American experience on the HBCU campuses.
But wait a minute. I want to go back just a half step. Students have already had, I don't know what that thing was you mentioned about scholarships, but they've already had them taken?
Yeah. So basically, Howard looked at And I guess I will say alleged because, I don't know. Well, I do know because I was told, but I don't know, legally, I don't want to get in trouble. But basically, from what I was told by members within the program, is that Howard took away their financially need-based scholarships. So they now only have access to merit-based scholarships, which can be even harder on them just because, especially if you're living halfway around the world, you're probably going to need more money than maybe someone like me who lives 3 hours away from DC. And even for instances like winter break that's coming up, I just have to drive 3 hours to go home. But having to take a plane to outside of the US, and then sometimes having to deal with immigration issues, and there's only 2 people working in the office for the international students. So even if it's at like 3 a.m. and immigration wants to call them up because they have to call Howard as an institution, you have 2 people working in that office. So it's understaffed. But that's just international students. And then when you incorporate Muslim students on top of that, needing to fight for a prayer room every single year, when Christians, we don't have to do that. Our right to pray is already there. It's already obvious. It's a given. But to have to fight for a prayer room is insane.
So the reason the rest of us don't know this, Naeem and Edward, is because we're not writing. I need for you guys to put on your journalistic. I don't know, and I'm down the road from Howard. I don't know. I did not know that any of this is happening. I mean, you turn your focus where the news turns your focus, kind of. And what I want to ask lawyers is any of what's already happened actionable?
So some of it potentially. So CARE, as Saad mentioned, has filed a lawsuit against Governor DeSantis in Florida on behalf of students there who his government is attempting to silence because of their membership in a Palestinian rights organization. Workers have been terminated or had their job offers withdrawn, including law students. Our Chicago chapter has filed an EOC complaint over that. In Maryland, a teacher was suspended simply because she put in her email subject line a reference to Palestinian rights, while other teachers can put things celebrating Pride Month and Black Lives Matter, and that's fine in that school system. The moment she mentioned Palestine, they pulled her off the job. So an EEOC complaint has been filed.
But that's why we got to write, young man. I know you have no time left in the day, but writing. Here's a question. What is the role of APAC and such organizations on college campuses? They don't seem to have any problem with freedom of speech.
So APAC, and I'll say this briefly, you're right, Doctor, I'll have to leave momentarily to pray, but APAC is a political organization that mostly focuses on elections and members of Congress and the White House and trying to convince our policymakers to adopt policies that are incredibly deferential to the far-right Israeli government. This is a very right-wing organization, very hostile to Americans who advocate for Palestinian human rights. But to my understanding, I know they have a youth effort that does reach out to students and tries to encourage them to join APAC when they're young. But I've not heard much about them being active in college fights. There are other organizations, call them pro-Israel organizations that operate on college campuses or advocate on college campuses for that perspective. Don't know if APAC is one of them, but whatever you want to call them, whoever they are, certainly there is a concerted effort to criticize and try to silence students who speak up for Palestinian human rights. In fact, the Anti-Defamation League's CEO was caught on audio recording, I think a few weeks ago, saying that he is terrified about the fact that students, young people across the country, are sympathetic to the suffering of the Palestinian people, and that is the biggest problem that his organization must address, that young people recognize that Palestinians are suffering and that our U.S. foreign policy should change in a more humane and just direction.
Attorney Simpkins, last words, quickly.
I think the thing that I found most personally effective in this discussion actually was our students' discussion of the threats, if you will, that many of the students face in being vocal about their moral, their ethical, their political position on things. And I mean, I think we have to keep in mind that this is something that our people, you will, have faced for generations, right? When you speak truth to power, or when you advocate for change, when you point out inequality, unfairness, injustice, discrimination, you are always going to get pushback from the power structure, the social and political power structure. And it is not a small undertaking to continue to advocate and have your voice heard in the face of that. Not everybody can do that. I mean, you know, we saw our young people, but it's always been the young people that have been the vanguard.
Exactly.
Push for change.
But you're going to have some of us behind them.
Yes.
So that they can see that, or at least have a feeling that what they're doing is worthwhile. Attorney Gul, I did not ignore you.
No,
My producers are jumping up and down. I always go over time. Sydney, let me speak for all of us, which is, I think that, first of all, stay in touch. Stay in touch with these attorneys. You know, they are, and I know these men, they have 5 minutes to listen to a crisis. Oh, stop it. They got 5 minutes. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
The fact that you're a Christian student on campus is not the issue. The issue is you're giving us information that we would not have, right? And that we want to support you and others. Okay? This is Professor Aminah Al-Deen for Critical Talk. I've had a wonderful conversation, which will be continued. Is speech still free? I don't think so. There is, as Sydney has just informed us, a potentially devastating cost. This again is Critical Talk for Sound Visions, and we will be back next Monday evening. We will consider this particular issue again because the issues are not going away. But this time I want to do some cases. And I'm going to ask my guests to please stay on. Oh. Oh. Mm.